Hi and welcome to the fifth section in this course. So in this section, we're going to look at the entire serverless picture. So in the prior sessions, we had seen how we could use the API gateway. We also saw the integration between the API gateway and the AWS Lambda service. But now let's look at the entire serverless picture for applications. So in this section, we're going to look at AWS Serverless Multitie Architecture, so the overview. We'll also have a look at microservices. So this is something that is being adopted by a lot of new applications in the industry nowadays. We'll look at how to monitor your serverless application. And then as a bonus to this entire volume, what we're going to do is that we're going to build an entire application. So it's a sample application. We're going to divide this into three parts. So we're going to use the serverless components provided by AWS to build our application. So let's go over to the first video in this section, which is looking at the serverless multi-tier architecture overview in AWS. So in this video, we look at first what is a multi-tier architecture, a typical three-tier architecture, what are the alternatives provided by AWS to host this multi-tier architecture for applications. We'll look at some of the advantages for using these AWS alternatives. And finally, we'll also look at other alternatives available from AWS for having your entire application hosted on serverless components. So first is a multi-tier architecture. So prior, a long time ago, a lot of applications just was based on two tiers. So you just had probably the web tier that's used for hosting your websites, and that would connect to a database tier. But now you have multi-tier architecture adopted by a lot of applications. So one of the biggest advantages of having this multi-tier architecture is that it helps isolate different layers of your application. So you could have your web tier, which is responsible for ensuring that it creates the content which will be delivered to your users. And then you have the database tier or the data tier that's responsible for managing the underlying data for the application. So this is how you can isolate those different layers of your application. And how does this help? It helps in better maintenance. So you could just be responsible for managing the maintenance of the web tier separately and the data tier also separately. You can then also update. So in addition to maintenance, you could update the data tier separately and the web tier in a separate manner. So a typical three-tier architecture, you could have first your presentation tier. So let's say you are giving an application which is going to be looked at by users on their mobile devices. So you give a user interface to the user. This will be your presentation tier. This will then connect to probably a web server. The web server will be responsible for generating that content will be shown to the users on their mobile devices. So this web server will be hosted in a logic tier. And then finally, you can have the data tier, which will have your database server, which hosts the underlying data, which will be given to the web server and then given to the mobile device. So this is a typical three-tier architecture which you can have for your application. And I think this is pretty common. A lot of people will already be aware of such a tier. Now, in nowadays applications, what people will do is that this different tiers, your presentation tier, your logic tier, and your data tier will be hosted on infrastructure. So you will have servers to host the web server. You'll have a separate infrastructure physical server to host your database. Now when it comes to AWS, so AWS has a lot of alternatives for hosting these tiers. So for example, in the logic tier, you can use, as you've seen in our previous sections, the API gateway service and the AWS Lambda service. So these two services can be used to build those applications in your logic tier. For your data tier, you have the ability to use AWS Relation Database Service, DynamoDB, and AWS Aurora. And finally, for the presentation tier for mobile devices, you can actually use AWS Cognito, which can be used for identity management. So let's look at how you can have these alternatives in your different tiers. So let's have a presentation tier as it is. Now in the logic tier, you can now replace your web server. So the underlying infrastructure is gone away and you can use the API gateway service and the AWS Lambda service. And this can connect to your data tier. So what are the advantages? Obviously, we've seen this in all of our sections. You don't need to manage the underlying infrastructure. You don't need to manage the servers. Everything is managed for you by AWS. It scales on demand. So if you look at the API gateway service, if the demand increases, the number of users start accessing your logic tier, then this infrastructure is scaled automatically based on the demand. Next, you can also integrate IAM policies. We've also seen this. So identity and access management policies can be used for security purposes. And all of this allows you to save on time. So you can just focus on the software development. Again, we have more alternatives. So let's look at again our tiers. So we've already looked at our logic tier. Now, if you want to also have the data tier on a serverless architecture, then you can use the AWS DynamoDB service. So the AWS DynamoDB database is a fully managed NoSQL database provided by AWS. Now, other alternatives for actually having a serverless architecture end-to-end, you can use the simple storage service. This is good if you're hosting static websites. You can use Amazon Elastic Cache. So this can be used to cache your common resources. So if there are web pages or web content which is actually being requested by users on a common basis, you can use Elastic Cache to cache those resources and then deliver it to the users. You can then use Secure Token Service for authentication tokens. Now, if you look back at our tiers again, so just an addition. So in the logic tier, in addition to having the API gateway and the AWS Lambda service, you can also have the AWS Elastic Cache service to cache those common queries.